Scott rushing, rushing around, rushing water. My son's name was Tyler, T-Y-L-E-R, Scott rushing. My only son. I have a daughter, and that was our whole family. My wife, my son, my daughter, and I. So now I have one child. The location that Tyler was killed is Chico, California. Chico is probably best known as the home of Chico State University, California State system. And actually my wife is a graduate. Tyler's mother is a graduate of Chico State, and my wife was a teacher. She was not able to go back to the classroom after her son was killed. She had an emotional issue with losing her only son and seeing him in the morgue coming out of the refrigerator. It affected her. It affected me too, but I'm just trying to overcome the emotional burden and do things like this, be able to tell my son's story. I think it's important for people to know, or I wouldn't be here. So Tyler was killed in Chico, California by a combination of a private armed security guard who was 23 years old, and that guard had a degree from Chico State University in criminal justice. He was a member of the Chico Police Department volunteers, and he had applied to be a correctional officer, and in the meantime he was working as an armed guard. So in my opinion, he showed a bent for law enforcement, and I think the use of weapons, because he was with a private security company that are armed, which is a little unusual to have armed guards in a rural community in a college town. You know, unarmed guards is pretty normal. We have them here today. But armed guards is a big responsibility to carry a gun if you're a guard. The date of death was July 23rd, 2017, approximately 4 years ago. We'll start with the security guard who had, I'll call it, an interaction with my son outside the building very late Sunday evening on July 23rd. The business was closed. It happened to be a title and escrow company, and I'm a real estate broker, so it's kind of ironic. My son was allegedly burglarizing this building, although no one saw him inside the building, including the guard, there's no security camera footage, but nevertheless an alarm went off in the building, and a guard shows up, and he used his gun. His name is Edgar Sanchez, 23-year-old. I assume he lived in Chico. I really don't know where he lived, but very young man, very heavily armed, and he was ordered to go check out the alarm. And that's not unusual. You know, I own real estate, and I am a property manager, and occasionally people set off an alarm. You know, employees, janitors. So it's not unusual to have the police show up to investigate an alarm. But when a guard comes to a building at night and he pulls out his gun and he's using the tactical flashlight on his pistol, which is a Glock, and he's going around the building using, instead of his standard flashlight, which is like a baton, if you've seen them, they're designed to be a club, the flashlights. He didn't like that, this guard, Sanchez. He liked to use his gun. So his finger is right on the trigger guard, and he's pressing the light. He goes into the patio, which is attached to the building, through the bushes, through the fence. He's unannounced. He's dressed in black. He's got a gun out. And my son and he have an interaction of some sort. We don't really know what happened. The guard did turn his body-worn camera on, his own personal body-worn camera on, a few seconds before he shot Tyler. And it appears that my son tried to use a small flower vase and hit Edgar Sanchez on the wrist to try to knock the gun out of his wrist, out of his hands. Unfortunately, Tyler was not successful, and Sanchez pulled the trigger. And my son was shot right over his left nipple with a hollow point load. At that point, the guard My son turned and really ran in the patio, but he ran back into the building, and the guard was chasing him with the gun. And just a side note to that, under California state law, guards are not allowed to use guns to investigate burglar alarms. The guns are only for defense. For example, if my son were to leave the building and attack the guard, then the guard could pull a gun and use it. But a guard is not allowed by state law to pull the gun out and use the light and go investigate an alarm, because these kind of things can happen. Your finger's close to the trigger. So, and being unannounced, which is also required by law, my son, I can only guess, had no idea who was coming at him with a gun on this patio. My son was on the patio. There's still no proof he was a burglar, as I said. No images, no witnesses, and there were a few things on the patio. Copy supplies, a couple of like legal boxes of miscellaneous, some fruit juice from the break room. We don't even know if Tyler had put those out there. There's evidence there were other people on the patio. A neighboring motel manager heard voices. She had called 911 at the time my son was shot by the guard. The Chico Police Department never followed up on it. So we have a guard who's a wannabe cop, Robert. That is my initial argument. The guard is a wannabe cop by his history and by his actions that night. He was also known as Little Robo at his company, Little Robo. I think that's a reference to the RoboCop movies. Heavily armed, untouchable police officer. That's RoboCop. His colleagues called him Little Robo because he was a small man, armed to the teeth. And he's a security guard. He's a private guard. He's not a cop, not a sheriff. Nevertheless, he shoots my son. My son goes into the building, goes into the bathroom of this building. Then the police arrive. Within 2 minutes, the SWAT team, numerous officers are at the scene. Some of this is on the body-worn camera that I have, the images. Some has been edited and clipped out by the DA that was given me. But nevertheless, my son goes into the bathroom. We found out later he attempted to give himself first aid. He wrapped a bandage around his chest because he had a sucking chest wound that had cracked a number of his ribs, his arm, and the bullet had exited his elbow, the first shot. So he was bleeding heavily and locked in this bathroom. The police show up and they're trying to talk him out of the bathroom. For whatever reason, he didn't cooperate. So the sergeant from Chico Police, his name is Scott Allen Ruppel. He's the strangler, by the way, to kind of wrap this all up. Scott Allen Ruppel is the sergeant. He took control of trying to extract Tyler from the bathroom on a medical rescue because they knew he'd been shot and they knew it was a chest wound, a torso wound. So they could see blood underneath the bathroom door. So they waited about a half an hour for the canine to arrive. The sheriff's department brought, it's not a German Shepherd, it's a Belgian Malinois. Belgian Malinois, the public doesn't know about. They're more aggressive, they bite harder, and they're more scary than a German Shepherd. German Shepherds can get distracted. Belgian Malinois are picked by law enforcement because they can focus more on the suspect, or on, and that's something I didn't know. I learned from this process over 4 years. My argument, though, Robert, is why do you need a canine on a medical rescue? Why do you break open a bathroom door, launch an entry? The first person in the bathroom was an officer with a ballistic shield. The second person in was the canine handler and his dog, and he let the dog off the lead. He let the dog go around my son's legs. And the officer himself, the deputy, said he could see his dog biting my son from ankle to armpit, and the dog's snout was between my son's legs. Now think about that for a minute. The officer's saying, bite, bite, bite to his dog, good boy, bite, 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 good boy, and the snout is between my son's legs. How many people could comply to give up, stop resisting, with a canine between your leg, an officer pushing a ballistic shield, and I have body-worn camera of that, which you'll see because I will send it to you. So he resisted arrest. He was flailing around. And during that flailing, allegedly my son got a hold of a ballpoint pen out of one of the officer's shirt pockets. A regular ballpoint pen, plastic with a little metal tip. And supposedly he got a hold of that and he hit one of the officers, the Scott Allen Ruppel, in the neck with the pen, scratched him. So Officer Ruppel, who was choking Tyler, they were face to face. And somehow my son, in spite of the wound to his left arm, being held by the other officers, somehow my son got a hold of this pen. The officer got a scratch. He gets mad. He steps back. He pulls out his gun. He puts the gun to my son's trachea, and he pulls the trigger. So the first shot from Sergeant Ruppel goes through my son's throat, exits the back of his neck. Then as my son, it's unclear on the body-worn cameras, but my son is actually being held by the sheriff, and I've got pictures of that. The dog had him low, the sheriff had him high, and because my son didn't fall down fast enough, my son got shot in the back of the head. So he had a hole in the back of his head and an exit wound in his jaw. Then my son fell to the floor. Now again, this is on a medical rescue. This is not even a felony. This is a suspected burglar who's been injured. So after my son falls on the floor, one of the officers, his name is Fleer, Alex Fleer, he grabs a taser. So when my son's laying on the floor in his own blood, he gets a 50,000 volt ride. The sheriff calls it a ride. And then Officer Fleer, in his deposition and his testimony to the investigators, says he was afraid my son was playing possum, my son was still a threat, he was going to jump up and attack the officers. So my son got tased on his bare back, and because the dog had pulled his pants down, one of the barbs hit my son in the buttocks, the other in the back. And my son got a ride from Officer Fleer. At that point, they jumped on my son, handcuffed him, brutally dragged him out of the bathroom, and of course the medics did try to rescue him, but he was dead at the scene. And they declared him dead at the scene. And what's really offensive to me, he didn't even get to die at the hospital. They put him in a bag and his body was there for 8 hours on the floor of that building while they waited for the coroner to come and examine the body. Then the body went back in the bag and went to the mortuary for an autopsy. So the whole system of escalation of trying to help a wounded suspect, they didn't even know really who was in the bathroom because the guard didn't know who it was. And after the guard left the patio, the officers went into the bathroom and they didn't know who was in there. They could see the blood though, coming from underneath the door. They tried to establish communication, but all they could hear was moaning and groaning. One of the important things I should mention is when Sergeant Ruppel announced that he was from the Chico Police, is there anybody here? My son did say, F you, I've got a gun. My son was in the bathroom. He'd been shot. He'd been bleeding for a half an hour. And he did say, he didn't know who was on the other side of the door, but he did say, F you, I have a gun. He didn't have a gun. He had no weapons at all. But because he said that, the officers, you could hear them in these body-worn cameras. They start ratcheting up. Well, he might have a gun. Well, he's certainly got a knife. Well, he's probably got glass from the mirror. Well, what else? Oh, you can hear them talking themselves up, getting their testosterone going because they want to see action. So by the time the dog got there, and that dog is barking and whining, they can't wait to go into action. Now this is a medical extraction to save my son. 42 seconds after the break-in, 42 seconds, Officer Ruppel had shot my son through the throat. Just 42 seconds. And then 2 seconds later, my son got a shot in the back of his head. So my son was dead. That's a medical rescue. All that information also, Robert, was kept from me for weeks and weeks and weeks. The body-worn cameras, and we're still getting information. Just a few weeks ago, I got some video camera of the interviews of the officers, and I found out the officer in charge of this extraction was not the Sergeant Ruppel. There was a lieutenant also there, as well as the sergeant, and they gave over command to the dog handler, who 2 years on the job, 1 year with the dog. They turned over the rescue of my son to one of the youngest officers present, the dog handler. And my argument is that dog just accelerated. My son must have been in total panic mode, assuming he could hear the dog through the door, and the dog is extremely loud. If you can imagine, in a bathroom too. It's all tile, a barking, whining dog. Are you going to give up to a barking, whining dog? And I can understand using the dog for a deterrent. But once my son did not give himself up, the dog should have gone away. And that should not have been used on my son. That dog escalated my son's resistance, as it would any man or woman probably being bitten. And he can't go anywhere. He's in a bathroom. No flight. You know, you've heard of fight or flight. He has nowhere to go. He's being choked. He's being bitten. He ended up getting shot twice, and then he gets tased. And the district attorney says, totally justified, exonerates the guard, exonerates the officers. I have no recourse at all, except a civil lawsuit. So let's talk about that for a second. I did hire an attorney. Not too long after my son was killed, and we filed the initial claim. It's called a 910 claim in January of, that would be 2018. We filed a formal case against the officers and the guard and the sheriff in June of 2018. The district court, the 9th District Court of California, which is a federal court, dismissed the case and justified the actions of the officers. And my legal team has appealed that dismissal of my son's case, and right now, as of today, we have an appeal in the 9th Circuit Court of Appeal on October 5th. And my attorneys will make a presentation to a three-member appellate panel to decide if my son has a jury trial or not. And that's where I am. I'm hoping on October 5th and praying on October 5th that I'll get a panel of judges that'll realize the officers used unnecessary lethal force. The guard violated state policy. They used unnecessary lethal force by interjecting the dog into this medical rescue. And then when they broke in, instead of using a taser or pepper spray, think about it, he'd already been shot. So a pepper spray in the eye would have been very effective. They could have used the batons. A taser would have been the appropriate thing to do. But they start grabbing him and the dog starts fighting him. And of course, he'd been bleeding out for half an hour. Blood's coming underneath the door. They knew what they were dealing with, but they treated him like he was some kind of a wild animal. Really worse. Wild animal gets a tranquilizer dart. You know, my son gets a dog bite, he gets choked, shot through the throat, shot in the back of the head, and then for good measure he gets tased. And they say it was all reasonable, the district attorney. His name is Michael L. Ramsey. And the deputy sheriff in charge, his name is Dickerson, Ian Dickerson. And it turns out that he was actually in charge of the extraction, the botched extraction, because he was the dog handler. That seems to be a policy. It's a bad policy. Why would you use a dog on a medical rescue? On a mental health call, you don't need a dog. That just accelerates the anxiety of everybody present. And you'll see it on the film that I send you. My son was autopsied almost immediately after he was taken from the building. There were no drugs in his system, except for a trace amount of marijuana, which is not enough to really make someone aggressive and resist the dog, resist the officers. But I still didn't trust the Butte County coroner because he's under the control of the district attorney. Michael L. Ramsey's an employee of the county. So in spite of the emotional burden and the turmoil of having my son, being told my son's dead, killed by police, which is a total shock, I arranged a private autopsy, and I had his body moved from Chico to Los Angeles, where it was re-autopsied, and all the lab work was redone. They found no drugs whatsoever in my son's system. So they first wanted to blame it on psychotic drugs, either some kind of mushroom or mescaline or PCP or methamphetamine. I didn't think my son was doing any of those drugs. Turns out I was right. There were no drugs in his system. But that was the allegation that the district attorney made as part of his case. We don't care what Mr. Rushing's pathologist says. We still believe he was on an untraceable psychotic drug the night he attacked our officers and he attacked the guard. And of course I don't agree with any of that. And over the years, Robert, we've had expert witnesses, depositions, and we're still getting information. Just as of June, the district attorney released the actual investigation interviews between the district attorney's investigators and the shooting officers. We just got those in June, 4 years after the event. That's how I know one of the least qualified officers present, that was the deputy sheriff, took control over the lieutenant and the sergeant because he was a dog handler. I was not even told that it was the dog handler that strategized the extraction of my son. That went south, went from a medical rescue to a killing. He was killed, it's that simple. He was alive when he went into the bathroom. He was wounded, but alive. He left the bathroom, dragged out, shredded. And therefore, I'm here. My life is upside down. I can add to that I'll talk to you a little bit about the effect. This is something I would like to get during my journey and talking to many retired police officers, lawyers, expert witnesses, private investigators. They agree with my position that it was an unnecessary use of lethal force, that the guard violated state laws and his own company policy in investigating an alarm with a gun out. So I have very qualified people that have encouraged me to continue my lawsuit in spite of the dismissal in the federal district court. It's not just an angry dad. I am an angry dad, but when a real professional looks over body-worn cameras, looks at what guard did, looks at the use of the dog, looks at the fact that the sergeant in charge shoots a suspect who's being held through the neck, and then a second shot through the back of the head while he's being held, that's concerned all the professionals that I've talked to. So it isn't just me being angry. These guys and gals have been reaching out to me, and it's keeping me going because the emotional burden is very high. The financial burden is very high. Most of the people that are here today, they're poor people. They don't have the money to pay, and something that the public needs to know is when someone files a lawsuit, like I have in this case, the prevailing party gets their legal fees paid. So if I lose this case, and right now I've lost, I've appealed the initial dismissal, but if I lose, I not only have to pay my attorneys, I have to pay the defense attorneys as well. And I already received a bill from Butte County, City of Chico, and the Armed Guard Company for $110,000 for their defense on killing my son. And one of the really sickening things, and I want on record, is as part of this deposition process, my wife and I were deposed, which is understandable. Our son was killed, they wanted to know the background. But I was deposed for 7 hours over 2 days by 3 attorneys. I didn't kill anybody. My wife was deposed for 3 hours by these 3 attorneys. So they had us 10 hours, they deposed my wife and I, about the killing of our son. And they were looking for things like his mental stability. Was he suicidal? Did he have a history of drug use? What was your relationship? When did you take your last vacation? They're looking for any little bit of dirt to vilify my son and my wife and I. And it's just horrible. It's very contentious. They also subpoenaed I had been seeing a psychiatrist, for help since my son was killed. They subpoenaed my psychiatric records from my psychiatrist. And you tell me how many people want their confidential, private medical records to be deposed, to be used in court, potentially used as evidence in court. But we cooperated because we didn't want to jeopardize our case. So my wife's medical records and her psychiatric records and my psychiatric records had to be divulged. And then they deposed my psychiatrist. They deposed my wife's medical provider, who's a therapist. And they're threatening to use that in court, of course, if we proceed. And I think it's just, and then they send us a bill for it. Then we get a bill for the deposition of our physician. and for reviewing our medical records regarding the death of our son, that we didn't kill anybody. And yet they have the right to do that. The defense has the right, and if we don't cooperate, then we jeopardize our son's case legally. It could be dismissed. It was dismissed anyway in spite of our cooperation. So the emotional burden, the financial burden, the lack of justice, the lack of a civilian trial, you know, everybody goes up thinking you get your day in court if you do something wrong. You should get your day in court. If Tyler was a burglar, well, so be it. He goes, you know, he has to pay for his crime. But you don't kill somebody who's suspected of something. That is not our law. The police and the guard are not judge, jury, and executioner. And they hide behind qualified immunity. As the first thing thrown in my face is the officers have the right to kill your son. They have qualified immunity. And of course he struck the guard and he resisted arrest. I said, but why? And he goes, well, he didn't comply. But a dog had a snout between his legs. I'd like to see one of your officers comply in that situation. I would really like to have them experience that, see if they could relax, especially if they've been shot. My son had been shot through the chest. It wasn't a splinter. It was a serious torso wound, a sucking chest wound. So the whole thing from the beginning, being notified your son's dead, to where we are now on appeal, it's absolutely a nightmare. It's a twilight zone. It's an emotional burden. It's a financial burden. And there's no recourse. You can walk away. We could cocoon ourselves. My wife was not able to go back to work again. She's had an emotional, I would say, breakdown. My daughter had a very difficult time emotionally as well, Tyler's sister. And it's been hard for me as well, but I'm so determined. My anger is driving me. My anger is what's motivating me to be here, to talk to you, to tell this story. And of course I'm hoping we prevail, because I want these officers to tell a civilian jury why they had to use this lethal force against my son, who was just a suspect on a medical rescue, Robert. I want to hear them somehow convince a jury. Then maybe I'll decide to walk away at that point. But until I have that jury trial, and it's been denied me so far, I'm not stopping, legally this case. And my lesson to those people who will watch this will be, the injustice system is really true. It's too stacked, it's too deferential towards the police. I mean, they can literally kill the wrong person and have qualified immunity. And that's just not right. They need to suffer consequences. Not only the police, Robert, but their higher ups. This is one of my thoughts. If let's say the officers that were the supervisors of Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd, as we all know, last year, if they had lost their job, if they had gone to jail, as well as Derek Chauvin, maybe for a lesser time, because one of their subordinates used excessive force in killing George Floyd. You tell me if the chief or the DA has to serve time, what will happen to the culture of policing? It practically changed overnight. Yeah. If the officers in charge are responsible for their subordinates. And that's how the military works. If a Marine kills the wrong person, that Marine, his sergeant, his lieutenant, everybody up the chain is disciplined. But in police, they don't have that chain. An officer literally can get away with murder. And just say, oh, no, my bad. That's wrong. Qualified immunity has been misused and abused. And that's one of the reasons we didn't really even get to talk about it, but that would be one of my goals, is to push the legislatures in each state to soften, change, eliminate qualified immunity. What I would love to see is a nationwide network, like an organization like MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, for example. This would be families of who've lost loved ones in officer-involved shootings, let's say. And like me, I had no experience in the legal system at all until my son was killed. And then you're thrust into it, everything from the autopsy to the DA, to the investigations, identifying the body. It's a nightmare from the get-go. And I hear it from all these people. Their son goes out to get some juice and he's killed at the 7-Eleven. This is a common pattern. It's not me exaggerating. And they have no recourse. What attorneys will help them? what should they say to the police? Should they cooperate? How far do they go? We families need to have a nationwide system, and I'm hoping this will be the seed for that, this event, the Impacted Families event, for something like Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. So for the family that loses a loved one, can call somebody and say, you know, Mrs. Victim, you know, don't talk to the police. Call this attorney in your area. He will counsel you. He's been trained. He's worked with us. He knows what you're going through. Give this guy or gal a call. So we give the family some direction. What I've learned, Robert, is the people are just like me. They're an emotional basket case. My wife couldn't speak. You know, my daughter's in tears full time. I couldn't work. And yet I've got to make all these decisions, you know, everything from embalming, or, you know, cremation. It's just a horrible series of decisions you have to make with a 34-year-old. And the last time you saw him and talked to him, he was alive and well and happy. And then you see him pulled out of a refrigerator, bitten with holes in his throat and his chest. It's a very surreal scene, and I believe a nationwide network to assist families in this situation would be a great legacy if I could get something like that going, like MAAD. MAAD has been very effective in cutting down drunk driving deaths in this country, and I would love to do the same thing. Drunk drivers are just as dangerous as road cops, so they both kill, and I believe there's thousands of people since my son has been killed. Statistically, over 1,000 people a year are killed in officer-involved shootings. So just since my son was killed 4 years ago, approximately 4,000 families are going through what I'm going through. That's a lot of power. If our 4,000 families, just since were together and we started hiring and getting behind politicians, we could move the needle. We could threaten legally and with political clout the injustice system. And that's what the message I would love everybody to get, is to join me. And because of social media, it's very doable. The whole thing is doable. And that is, and also use your body-worn camera. Be a cop watcher as much as you can in your neighborhood. If you see something happen, watch it. If you see something you can film and you don't think you're going to get arrested, film it. Because cell phones are wonderful, and they've already, well, George Floyd, if it hadn't been for those brave people filming, those officers would have been probably promoted. But they didn't happen that way because of the concrete body-worn camera film. So those would be the two things. An officer can resign from a department to avoid the internal affairs investigation. That's legal, but boy, it stings.
Yeah, it screams guilt.
Yeah, it does. And I'm sure that it hastened his retirement, that he killed a young man, my son, and then he gets caught strangling a suspect.
Officer, sit back. I'm sitting! Don't fucking force me! Sit back.
You are not in charge here.
I can stand my own free will! I can stand my own free will! Knock it off.
Do you understand?
Chico 35, we're code 4-1 detained.
Stop!
Okay, we're not going to tolerate this.
Mike.
The DA did file misdemeanor charges for the strangling, but a local county it's a small rural county, and the DA runs the county like a strong boss. So the jury acquitted, the cop. I wasn't surprised, especially when I was there for the whole trial for the strangling. The chairman of the jury admitted to the judge that he personally knew the officer, and they had had coffee together, and he ended up being chairman of the jury to vote guilty or not guilty for the strangling of this. So you tell me, was it a biased jury or was it a hand-picked jury of friends? When the jury foreman says, oh, I know the officer, yes, he's very pleasant, and we've met socially, and we've had coffee, and this is the jury foreman. What chance did that kid have? None. Officer is acquitted, but it allowed me to see the sergeant in a trial, the one that did most of the killing. There was a group. So I got to see the officer on the stand, and then I realized what kind of a monster really he was. in my opinion. And so I coupled together a video and I sent it out to several media outlets, including the Real News Network, the Young Turks, Democracy Now!, MSNBC, 60 Minutes, and the Real News Network did call me, the producers, and they did interview me. And my story, based on my cobbled video, did go out on YouTube on the Real News Network. And over 70,000 people have viewed it, which is very amazing. It's one of their larger responses on the Real News Network. And I have received about 1,200 emails in support of my legal action to try to bring the officers, the killers, to justice. And there were a couple of dozen, very rude emails. But by and large, over 1,000 of them were, go for it, attaboy, you got a case. So in my son's name, I can't bring him back. And I'm in court, and I'm struggling to get a trial. That's what I'm pushing for, a civilian jury trial. It got the people from the Real News Network very excited because they'd noticed rural parts of the country, whether it's California, Florida, whatever, the bar for hiring police officers is very low. And quite often, Robert, they hire officers that had discipline problems in other departments. They come in as a lateral or as a new hire. So the bar and the quality of the officers is very low, and they're given guns. And this is a pattern now that's come out, that rather than be fired or decertified, an officer can resign from a department and sign up and get hired at an office down the street or an office in another state. And that's being done all the time. It's being done in California. I know it's being done elsewhere. That has to stop. That lack of disclosure when someone's a discipline problem, usually it's because of use of force or racism or something terrible, and they're told, listen, Robert, we'll give you two choices. We'll fire you, we'll decertify you, or you can resign and just say you want to relocate with the kids. So they resign. Then when they apply, 100 miles away at a new department, I decided I wanted to live, closer to the mountains or something. And they get hired immediately. This is a real pattern until they kill somebody. And then they start looking at his history and say, how did that guy get on this department? But it's too late to the victim's family. It's too late. And those kind of practices, if we had the organization that I'm talking about, like MAD, we could expose these officers that are disciplinary problems as they go, I call them gypsy cops, as they go from department to department. Nobody wants, you don't want to give, have you ever been pulled over? Have you had a ticket?
Yes.
How do you feel when the cop comes to your window?
Scared.
It's not relaxing, is it?
No.
What if that cop had just had an argument with his wife? What if he's got a bad back and he's taking a pain, OxyContin? What if you reach for your glove compartment to get your registration and he thinks you're reaching for a gun? He has the right to kill you, just on that traffic stop. And there's nothing your family can do about that because of qualified immunity. That has to change. That kind of protection, that kind of procedure is absolutely wrong. And you've had a taste of it. Just getting pulled over for a ticket is very nerve-wracking. I've not talked to one person has said they were very relaxed when that officer came to my door. They're all nervous and they all want to know why and what did they do wrong, and they're scared. Well, multiply that exponentially when in my son's situation, where he gets shot by a security guard and then this dog shows up and all these officers are outside the door. I mean, it's a terrible situation, and it's a culture, and it's a training, and it's a change of mind. It just has to be a paradigm shift from where we are now to real peace officers, which is communication. If you're speeding, get your ticket, take your medicine, go on your way. But when they want to come up and they got their hand on their gun, show me your ID, show me your registration. You're nervous. You just told me you were, and I believe you because I'm nervous when that happens to me. I had 3 speeding tickets since my son was killed, and my heart was pounding when those officers came to the door. I don't have any hidden guns, but just reaching for something in the car, reaching for your wallet, They have the right to say, I thought he was going for a gun. I thought I saw a knife. I thought I saw something flash. I was scared for my life. Bang, 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 bang. You see it all the time. That kind of attitude has to change. It has to be communication, not use of force. That's what policing really, to me, is about. Like I said, you're breaking the law, you run a stop sign, you get your ticket, you pay for your ticket. But to have to worry about being killed, that shouldn't be part of the equation. So I'm rattling on, but that's my message.
Handcuffs.
Yeah, and if they say get out, put your hands on them, and if you do any, and you can have this. If you're a person of color, it's 10 times, it's got to be 10 times more dangerous for someone like us who are white. It just is.
Yes.
It's sad, it's horrible, but it's true. And it's got to end. This has to end. My name is Scott Rushing, and I'm here to impact the families of that. And I would love for every case that has been closed by the Department of Justice, by local agencies, to be reopened and fully investigated by an unbiased, independent, federal group of professionals. And it can be done by retired police officers, retired social workers, retired psychologists, who could investigate every single killing that's of an unarmed person or someone in question. Yes, all of these investigations, I'm glad you asked me, because police should not be able to investigate themselves. And that's what happens in the system right now. Police are investigating their colleagues, and of course that blue wall comes up, their stories match. It's impossible to get justice. Only way to beat that is for federal legislation to come down and say police cannot investigate themselves. We need civilian oversight of law enforcement. We need more civilian involvement, like a school board or a planning commission. Every police department should have a civilian oversight board. It should be just as ubiquitous. If you can have a school board, you can have a civilian oversight board. How hard is that? It's not. Every little town in this country has a school board, a city council, a planning commission. You need a civilian oversight of law enforcement commission. And it doesn't have to be cops. It shouldn't be cops. It should be journalists and real estate brokers and school teachers, and they should be, telling the police how we want our community policed. And that doesn't mean using military surplus and Bearcats and submachine guns, which is being used in Butte County where my son was killed. They were not used on him, but they have used military surplus on victims in Butte County since my son was killed. Most of the public does not know that these departments are taking military surplus from the Middle East. I mean, these are civilians. This is not a war.
No.
These are civilians they're going to be using those on. So yes, that's why I'm so glad, and that's what I want everybody here, the impacted families, to realize that. And I hope it gets to somebody, the Department of Justice, Mayor Garland, to start reinvestigating every single officer of a fall shooting where the police have investigated themselves regarding the killing. That is a total conflict of interest, and that has to end.